This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, Amen. Please be seated. As some of you know, I grew up as a Navy junior, which is only to say my father was a career naval officer. He and my mother were both the children of naval officers also, and so they decided we needed to have something they felt they'd never had. Roots. Talking about roots. And so they bought a dairy farm in Virginia. And so when we were not in places like London or Japan or other such places, we were on a dairy farm in Virginia. And one of the things that we learned at an early age that you never said to my mother was, "I'm bored in the summertime." Now, the house sat on about 3 acres of yard. It's the country. And there were always dandelions to pull out of that yard. Now, Mother being the mother that she was, and she was really rather remarkable, had taught us that the origin of the term or the name dandelion was the French dent de lion, tooth of the lion. So we would always go out to see whether it looked really like a tooth. But there was always weeding to do. And of course, when we weren't blowing more of the dandelion around by blowing on it, we were pulling up weeds. And there were also, because my mother was a master gardener, there were always flower beds to be weeded. Now, because it was a dairy farm, the cows would get out and periodically would stomp in the middle of her plants, and we would hear about that too, but that's another story. But growing up in the country and on a farm and that sort of thing, and doing the kind of weeding that we were given to do, now there were also books to read, but sometimes in the summer in the country you wanted to be outside. So being outside was much more fun. And there were times when we would do fun things like take rocks out of fields in order to allow the disker to go through. So there were all kinds of activities. Some of them fun, some of them not so much fun, but all necessary. And part of this story that Jesus tells us, this parable that Jesus offers to us today, is one of those agrarian stories that we in the 21st century, unless we've had personal experience in the country, on farms, with farms of a variety of sorts, it's a little bit distant, and it's a little more difficult to comprehend exactly what Jesus is trying to say. Now, the explanation at the end of the gospel is always there if one so desires to go there. There's a part of that I choose not to go with. I'll go with what Jesus said in the story rather than in the allegory that explains it at some levels. Because then we get into this who's a weed and who's wheat. And that really is not the point of the story. Because if you reflect upon your own life, there are times when we have been both weed and wheat, depending on where we are in our journey in life. And one of the parts of this story that is agrarian to the nth degree is the fact that when wheat matures, the heads are so heavy with the grain that they'll flop over, and they hang heavy with grain. The darnel, the weed, on the other hand, sticks straight up and doesn't hang over with its grain. So it becomes much easier to discern what needs to be pulled out, that is the weed. I tell this story on Sheila, and she agreed, and she knew it was going to come, so you don't have to tell her that I told a story on her. She was sent out by her mother to weed the garden and to weed the flower beds, and she proceeded to pull out her mother's prize hollyhocks, because they looked like a weed to her. And there are those of us who were not particularly fond of hollyhocks and looked like a weed to me. But that, in fact, is a part of the point of this gospel reading. And that point is that sometimes we don't know the difference. And even more than that, the point is that we're not supposed to do the judging. That's not our task. Now, that's not to say we don't spend a lot of time either pointing fingers at others or pointing fingers at ourselves. That's not the point. The point ultimately, and the story is about the fact that that judging thing is God's prerogative and God's prerogative alone. As I mentioned in something I wrote this week, back in the 60s there was a button that was very popular, and it said something to the effect, "Don't be angry with me or be impatient with me." I can't remember the wording exactly. "God hasn't finished with me yet." And that really is also a point here. God has not finished with any of us. And it is God's prerogative to make any kind of judgment call that might be made. God is the one in charge. God is the one who makes the judgment calls. And God is not finished with us until we make and meet our Maker. But we spend an awful lot of time, both pointing fingers at others and pointing fingers at ourselves. And how often it is that we stand firmly announcing that we know the mind of God. We, me. And if it's different from yours, then I'm right and you're wrong. Isn't that the way it goes? The reality is, that's not our prerogative. There's a story that I heard this week that, again, is somewhat an example of this. There's the story of, and we've all been there. We get to an intersection, and the car in front of us, and I had it happen this week, where somebody was on the phone, and the light changes, and nobody moves, and you're impatient, and you get angry, and you may say something that is both inappropriate and uncalled for, and the other person, the car may have stalled. Mine was on her cell phone, annoyed me quite a bit. Doesn't make any difference. Then the light begins to change to yellow, and they get through, and you're still stuck there. And the story goes with this individual that a police car pulls up behind them because they have ranted and raged and pounded on their horn and, thrown their arms around and just become totally indignant. And the policeman comes up and arrests her and takes her off to jail and leaves her in lockup for a couple of hours, and then comes back and said, "Well, you can go now. I wanted to make sure, because your bumper sticker said, 'Follow me to Sunday school and come with me to church,' and you didn't sound, so I was sure you'd stolen the car. So I wanted to make sure that wasn't true." Our behavior and our actions sometimes, in terms of where we find ourselves, we've all done it. We've all done it. We might think we're somewhat more righteous and haven't done it, but we've done it. We've said it. But what Jesus says to us, take a deep breath. Stop trying so hard. Be patient with yourself. Be graceful with yourself. Because I haven't finished with you yet. Martin Luther King said, God's purpose is not wrathful judgment. God's purpose is redemption. And the road to redemption is by way of reconciliation. And only in that way will the world finally be saved. Redemption. And sometimes that means getting over ourselves, our arrogance, our pridefulness, for thinking that we do know the mind of God entirely. Doesn't give us a whole lot of wiggle room along the way. And one of the things that I firmly believe is that God does give us a lot of wiggle room and continues to invite us back again and again and again and again, in spite of our behavior, in spite of the way we treat one another, in spite of our pride. And he reminds us again and again as he invites us back that his mercy is sufficient, his grace is abundant, and we are all invited to the supper of the Lamb again and again and again. But we, in our arrogance, turn that off, say it's okay well, it's about me, but not about you. That's not what this gospel says. It says he continues to invite you up until the very last moment, beyond our ability to comprehend, and continues to offer us his loving embrace. Amen.